Jerry Shikuma, ACC's Home and Community-Based Programs Administrator. Welcome to our speaker series with Julie Interrante. Today, Julie joins us for Walking a Loved One Home. It's the third session in a four-part series that deals with end-of-life topics. Over the past couple of weeks, Julie has helped us learn about hospice care, about how to talk to a loved one about death and dying. She's also helped us explore how to create meaningful experiences for ourselves and our loved ones with limited time. These sessions have been heartfelt and thought-provoking. She's even introduced us to some special guests who have shared really personal and inspiring stories. So if you haven't had a chance to view it, I encourage you to get online and watch the recordings. You can go to YouTube and search for Julie Interrante, ACC. And by the way, this session is also going to be recorded, so you'll be able to see it after online as well. For those of you who are familiar with ACC, you know that we offer a wide range of programs. Anything from cooking demos, to Zumba, to financial planning, to current topics of the day, to history projects, and so much more. Well, this quarter, we decided to do something a little bit different. We decided to add Julie's end-of-life topics to our repertoire of classes. And we decided to do that because it is something that many in our community, especially caregivers, are dealing with without much coaching or guidance. And frankly, it's something that we all will have to face sometime during our lives. So ACC is interested in creating more programming around end-of-life topics, but we'd like to hear from you first. So please take the time to send us a comment at our email at classes@accsv.org. Tell us how you enjoyed this series. Tell us what in particular stood out to you about Julie's presentation. You can also tell us what you might say to someone else to encourage them to view a program like this. And also, don't be afraid to also leave a personal story. Feedback from you is really what helps us keep our programming relevant, and it helps us to get more support and do more outreach for future programs like this about topics that might be difficult to talk about, but so important. So again, if you can just take a few minutes and send us an email to classes@accsv.org, we'd really appreciate it. And now, on to today's show. It is really my pleasure to be able to introduce you to Julie Interrante. She's an end-of-life educator, a former hospital chaplain, and the author of this book, The Power of a Broken Open Heart. Julie, welcome back to ACC.
Thank you.
So glad.
It's very nice to be here again. Nice to see you. Thank you.
Nice to see you.
So Jerry is correct. We are going to talk today about walking a loved one home. Over the last 2 weeks, we've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. And so I know that there may be other questions that pop up for you. And we're going to try and answer those and get to those things today. One of the things that I think is really important when we talk about the idea of completing one's life, I use that phrase often, more often than dying, because in my mind, we all have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so this time that we call dying is really the completion time of our lives, and that we can actively participate in that. It's not something that necessarily is done to us, but it's something that we participate in. So today we're going to talk about the actual dying process. We're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like when someone is dying. We're going to talk about what it feels like for people who are caring for someone that they love who is dying. And I want to give you some resources that you can have in your own home that are very helpful. And once again, like the last 2 sessions, I have some lovely individuals here to share some of their personal stories. And so I'd like to introduce those people to you. If you were with us last week, you will recognize Nancy Stewart, who is here.
Hello.
Hi,
Hello.
Nancy. Thank
Hi.
you for being here.
Thank you.
Nancy is here, and she's going to share her story about when her husband, Fred, died. He died from pancreatic cancer, and she had hospice involved. So she's going to share some of that experience with us. You will also recognize Carol. She is coming to us via technology because she is in Georgia with her grandchildren. And Carol is going to share her story about when her husband Peter died. Peter died from dementia, and he was in skilled care at the time that he died. So we're going to hear from her as well. And then I want to introduce you for the first time to Sharon. She's sitting right here to my left. This is Sharon. And she is also going to share her experience of walking her husband through his dying process. And she has some specific things that are different than the stories of the others of us that are here. And so I just am happy to introduce them and welcome all of you. And I have to ask for just a minute here. For those of you who don't know me, I recently got some hearing aids, and they are ringing in my ear right now, and I'm not quite sure why, so let me just turn this all off. I apologize. Let me take care of that there. It's a little hard to concentrate when I have ringing in my ears. So thank you for that. So I want to start today with, so often in my experience of working with families who have a loved one who is dying, what I would observe and what I experienced was family members who didn't quite know what to do or what to say or how to be when someone began to do what we call actively dying, right? So someone might have been sick for a period of time, and then they start failing, and you can tell that they are now entering the dying process. So a lot of what that will look like is someone will, probably the first sign that people notice is that their loved one no longer wants anything to eat. And that's often a very difficult time for family because, first of all, if we think about it, we live in a culture, and pretty much all cultures have an attitude that if someone is ill and not doing well, what we do is feed them, right? We're going to feed them to help them feel better. When someone is dying, that is not the best thing for us to do, right? Because when someone starts to actively die, the body is now shutting down, right? It no longer needs or is going to want food or drink. So there might be a little bit of sipping that somebody decides to do, or they may all of a sudden say to you, I really want a hamburger. And the family will run out and get their favorite hamburger, come home, and by the time they get home, the person that they love takes one bite and then they're done. And this can tend to be kind of disturbing to the family. And what I want to say to you is that whole period of time is really normal. It's really, really natural. And who has a harder time with that often are those of us who love that person. So what is happening at that point is that everyone in the family is at a point where we all have to kind of begin to accept that the person that we love is actively dying and that there is less and less for any of us to do, right? Now we're moving into the time where what is the most important thing to do is to simply be present with the person that we love. That doesn't mean that the person isn't at all conscious, but as time moves on, over a course of days usually, someone will start talking less. They will start responding less. Family members might sit and hold hands with someone who's dying. They might talk to them, and for a little while, their loved one may respond, and then they may lapse into a very quiet time. Sometimes the other thing that we will see is, I've heard people often say, you know, like my dad, he's looking at me, but I feel like he's looking past me or through me. That is also very, very common, okay? And I'm going to give you my take on this. I don't know that this is true, but this is how I've always thought about it. And that is that as the body starts to give way, the life energy itself, however this all works, starts to put more attention to where it's going rather than where it is being in the body. And so someone can be looking at me, but also be kind of looking past me. And while we don't fully understand that, it is often during that time that you might hear a loved one start to talk to people who have died before them. I don't know. We'll find out if those, the women who are here to share their story had some of that experience, but I certainly have personally had that experience with people that I love and also with people that I worked with over the years in hospice. So these are all things that I think are important to at least hear and know about. Not everyone goes through exactly the same process, but everyone will have bits and pieces of this process. So as we're talking about this, I want to show you a little pamphlet that I want to encourage all of you to consider going online and getting. Oftentimes when you have hospice come in, a hospice will provide this pamphlet. It's called Gone From My Sight. And it is written by Barbara Cairns. She's been around for years and years. She does lovely work. This is one of the best pieces I've ever seen written on the signs and symptoms of the dying process. That's what this little book is about. And so I want to just show it to you. So it's written very simply. So she starts at, I think it is 3 months beforehand. Let me just see if I want to double check that. Right, 1 to 3 months prior to death. And she explains to you kind of what that's going to look like, okay? Then as you get to the back of the pamphlet, there's actually just a listing of the symptoms, the signs and symptoms. And so she just lists them very simply so that when you're in the actual process and seeing changes, you can go to this little book and they're just listed straight out for you. And it's very easy to find those signs and symptoms, okay? So I just want you to know about this little booklet and encourage you to go to bkbooks.com. There it is right there. It's on your screen. These little pamphlets are $3 a piece, and you can order one or you can order 100 of them. And families have found these extremely helpful because lots of us haven't walked someone through the dying process very often, or maybe even at all. And so when we begin to see changes, they can become scary if I don't know what I'm looking at. That's why this little book is so helpful, okay? If you have hospice on board and helping you with the process, they will also be very helpful for you, okay? But this is a way to empower yourself and to understand kind of what you're seeing, okay? So in a little bit, we're going to talk about how to say goodbye. We're going to put that up on the screen a little bit later so that you can begin to think about how do we say goodbye to someone that we love when we have the time to do that. One of the reasons that I think this is so important for us is because it makes a difference in how present we're able to stay through the dying process, and it makes a difference in how we grieve later. If we say goodbye and say all of the things that we want to say to the person that we love, it makes a difference in how we grieve. And so we will take some time to do that. But before we go into that, I want to take some time now and ask our 3 guests to tell us a little bit about their experience. And I want to start with Nancy this afternoon, okay? So if you would talk a bit about, again, you might just remind people what Fred died from. and kind of what that process was for you getting hospice in and all of the things that you did to get support for yourself.
Yes. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer ultimately only about 5 months before he died. And he'd been pretty much okay until then. We were advised by his regular doctor to go ahead and start hospice, which he didn't really want to do right away, but I kept researching and finally made the plunk. And they had a lot of helpful things at the time. And I want to emphasize how much help it was to me. The nurses were wonderful and would talk to me when he was there and when he wasn't there. And I could ask all kinds of questions. The social worker gave me contacts to learn and what I could do to be helpful. It's not a 24-hour care. They come in regularly and make appointments. And they had people that would help him shower. I was doing all of that for a while, and it was impossible for me to continue. And they had people that came in, and I could hear them laughing in the bathroom
Nice.
periodically, which was wonderful.
Right.
So that went on for about 4 months, and then he needed to be bedridden and needed 24-hour care. And through the references, I contacted the best Fijian caregivers. And the man that came to help Fred, they made an instant connection. They laughed and they were funny, and he did everything. He also, when the nurses came from hospice, they talked to him about how to do things. He was quite experienced already, and that went very well.
Can I ask, Nancy, how much time did your paid caregiver spend at the home with you guys? Was that how many hours a day? How did that work for you?
It was round the clock. He and his daughter worked together, and he would come in the daytime and she would come and spend the night. And many times I called her in the middle of the night. She would lie down, but she came and did what needed to be done.
So how was that a benefit to you? Now, go ahead. How was that a benefit to you in having 24-hour care in the house?
Oh, I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done it alone. And physically, he was bigger than I am. He needed a lot of physical care that I couldn't do.
Yeah.
So it was really very
I would
helpful.
think it also allowed you to get more rest, more sleep than you would have if you had not had that care.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
He had the hospital bed, and I brought a single bed into a larger room so that I slept next to him. I think they sort of expected that they would be sleeping by him, but that's not the way I wanted it. And so they were in the other room, and so if I thought he needed care, I would buzz them.
For the actual physical care, but you were
care.
Physically present sleeping next to him in a bed.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure that we don't miss this point here, and that is that it is so important to stay in touch with one's own heart and one's own gut around what do I need in this experience, as well as what does my husband, my wife, my daughter, my sister, whoever it is that you're caring for. So I appreciate, Nancy, that you said that really wasn't what they expected. They kind of expected they would sleep next to him. But for me, I needed to be there, right?
Yep.
And so can you talk then a little bit about how it went once it was you became aware that Fred was actively dying? Or did that even ever really happen for you? How did it go for you?
Well, I kept talking to them, of course, and they began to tell me he could go anytime. It could be a week, it could be days.
And when you say they, is that hospice?
The hospice people, yes,
Okay.
yes. And so I didn't know, and I was in and out some. I wasn't there the whole time, but he began to have physical breakdowns from the pancreatic cancer, and that made it pretty imminent from everything. Yeah.
So you also make another good point. When you say physical breakdowns, are you talking about sores, like bed sores?
Yes.
Okay, so this is also something that can be really helpful to know. When someone starts to actively die, that means that nothing is circulating well anymore because it doesn't need to, because the body is shutting down, right? And so sometimes what we will see is people get pressure sores, right? So if they're laying in one spot, they get pressure sores. Those we know can be very painful. And sometimes hospice will call in a specialist, a wound care specialist, to tend to those kinds of wounds. Now, if they're there for a long period of time, you will most certainly have someone who tends to that. Sometimes you don't see that skin breaking down until the last couple of days before someone dies. That can also be a sign that the body's giving way, right? All of this is important information for us as family members to have so that we recognize what we're seeing, okay? Because there is a part in all of us when someone that we love is dying. There's a part of us that wants to stay a bit in denial about it. It's like, no, I'm not ready. I don't want this to be happening, right? Even though we know that's the trajectory we're on, the human heart and the human condition wants to say no, not yet. So partly why we're sharing some of these signs and symptoms is so that we can help ourselves get clear about this is the direction we are going. Okay, thank you. So you mentioned something right before we started today about Fred and his eating, wanting to eat.
Well, I'm not so much sure after you were talking that he wanted to. This man that he bonded with said, okay, Fred, it's time that you had lunch, and he would do it. And here's a drink, and he would do it.
Right.
So I'm not sure.
So, and did he, I think you said he ate the day that he died, is that true?
Yes, that morning we had gotten some baby food things that didn't have to be chewed and so forth. And he took one of those that morning.
Yeah. So we never know, like I said earlier, how this is going to go for any individual. It happens less that people actively eat something on the day that they die than it is that they don't eat for several days up until that time, and often don't take water. You will get supplies from hospice if you have hospice involved. They'll bring out these little swabs that have little sponges on the end. I wish I had an example of one I could show it to you. They kind of look like little lollipops. They have little pink sponges on the end, and you can put that in water and kind of wipe out the inside of someone's mouth when they're dying, because what begins to happen is people's eyes will be closed kind of halfway, and often their chin drops, and so they will lay in bed mostly breathing through the mouth. Their mouths get dry, and one of the things we know that helps people stay comfortable is to keep their mouth clean, to keep it a little bit moist. They oftentimes aren't even aware of it, and all of that is okay, but we just want to keep people as comfortable as possible. So those are things that you can do. And so they get a little bit of moisture in the mouth, but they're not necessarily drinking anymore, okay? Was there anything else you wanted to share right now about that?
When you talked about the stare,
yes,
that was the ending with Fred. He looked, and I thought he was looking right at me. I said, "Are you looking at me?" And there was no reaction. And maybe 10 breaths later.
Were you with him when he died?
Yes,
Or you
holding
were?
his hand and rubbing his head.
And how did that feel for you? Were you okay with that?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
and especially after the sores, it was time.
Right.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. So, so Carol, I want to come to you, if we can, and I'm wondering if you will share. She's not hearing us. Give us just a minute. Okay, now can you hear me? Nope, she's not responding. Give us just a minute.
Ask her to turn up her volume.
Okay, can you hear me, Carol? No. So what I'll do is I'm going to move over to Sharon, and we'll get that taken care of, and we'll get back to you, Carol. Okay. So Sharon, I'm wondering if you would take a few minutes and kind of briefly explain your experience from Larry's experience in the hospital and then bringing him home.
Okay.
Just, yeah.
Okay, well, basically what happened about 5 days before he was placed on hospice, Larry had a seizure. And it was he had had previously 2 seizures 2 years ago, and the seizures were about a week apart. And at that time, when I brought him in, I luckily saw the same emergency room physician, and the second time she had said, because he was so stressed and so upset about being in an emergency room, at that they actually called in security to keep him from being combative, because he was.
So one of the things to remember here is that Larry had dementia, and so any place that is unfamiliar to him is going to be frightening. So was he admitted?
He was.
He was not, right?
They just took him. I'm not sure if that's called an admission or not.
Okay.
He had the seizure the first time, and I took him in, and they sent us home after a bunch of tests. And then a week later, he had another, so I took him back. And again, we were there for last time. They didn't run as many tests, but I don't know that he was ever admitted.
Okay.
She just said, "You don't need to go put him through this." And part of it, she said that oftentimes when somebody comes out of a seizure, they can be combative too.
Right.
Because with his Alzheimer's, he was not very combative.
Okay.
And they even put him on a medication to ease that the first time, which he was on when he sent him home. And that medicine, which is Keppra, it worked for 2 years, and then he had another seizure.
So
And-
that's the time we're talking about now,
Exactly.
right?
The
So-
week before that he's put on
Before he
hospice,
died.
or the 5 days, he had a seizure. The first seizure, I didn't even call 911 because the doctor had said you can take care of him at home, just put a pillow under his head, make sure he's breathing okay. That's what I did. Problem was he had fallen out of bed during the seizure. I couldn't get him back into bed, had to call Lift Assist 911. They got him back into bed. And then one day passed, and the next day he had another seizure.
So you go to the hospital,
Yes.
and you go through all kinds of
Yes,
testing and
yes.
process. And then
Yes.
at some point they say, we're going to discharge him.
Yes.
And someone says to you something about, I think he might be appropriate for hospice. Is this
Yes.
true?
Well, what had happened was that when we got there before 8, by 11 they had realized that he had pneumonia. So that was a contributing factor, they said, to what was happening with him, that it could have caused his seizures, although
Right, so-
last time he hadn't. So he had actually another seizure while we were there. right after the doctor left. And the doctor had said he was going to have Larry undergo a course of intravenous antibiotics, which they were just starting to hook up when he had his third seizure that
Right.
week.
So I kind of want to move, if we can,
Okay.
to the going home
Yes.
and
Sorry.
your understanding
being,
or
yes.
lack thereof
Yes, which
of
was-
what that meant for you.
And it was mostly a lack thereof, because what had
Right.
happened then
Which
was
is why I
that-
think this part of the
Right.
experience is important for people to hear, because
Right.
when we don't understand what is being told to us, we have expectations, and
Right.
then when they're not met, we can run into some issues that are difficult.
So
if
the
you
antibiotics
can-
were being administered, and it took about 2 hours, and in that time I waited for the doctor to come back. He didn't come back, but the nurse did. And she said, well, unfortunately, actually she was a discharge person, sorry. She said, unfortunately, because Larry only had 2 seizures and his pneumonia isn't advanced, it's aspiration pneumonia, we're sending you home. And she said, do you have help at home? And I said no, because I do not. I was taking care of Larry at home. I do had a caregiver come in for a couple of hours Tuesday and Friday to give me a break, but she didn't help with showering or anything like that. Up to that point, Larry was ambulatory. Then, so it,
But you take him home
Yes.
in your car,
yes, without any
assistance or
Yeah,
understanding.
exactly. And in fact, the part about what happened was that the discharge nurse said, have you got any help at home? And I said, no, I don't. My daughters work full time and I have a caregiver, but she doesn't even do the depends, she doesn't do showers, she just comes to break me so I can have a break Tuesdays and Fridays. So she said, would you be interested in hospice? And I said, yes, I would very much be interested. That's our plan. But he hasn't been ready for it yet, and she said, well, I think he's ready now. So she said, you should reach out and connect with hospice. And I said, okay. So they took him out
So he's not ambulatory at this
Right,
point.
no.
You take him home.
Yes.
And did you at that point think that hospice was going to meet you there, or that somehow you would have help at home?
No, but what I didn't realize was that he would not ever be ambulatory again. I
Right.
didn't realize his level of confusion at that time, because he was, granted he had advanced Alzheimer's, but he was ambulatory, he could get up and down our stairs.
But not at this point.
Not at this point. At this point,
Right.
I didn't even realize till I got home, and I tried to get him out of the car, and it was.
couldn't.
So what I ended up having happen was that a person there happened to have a little transport wheelchair, and
That's how you got him in the
that's
house.
how neighbors helped me put him in the wheelchair, get him into the house, take him up the stairs, get him into bed.
Right. So the reason that I think this part of Sharon's story is so important is because what we're talking about now is when someone that we love ends up in the hospital and they get discharged, so often as family members, we actually don't advocate well enough for ourselves, right? That's why I think this piece is so important. So if I know that the person that I'm taking home is going on to hospice, first of all, I have to understand that hospice is not going to meet me at the house, right? Hospice is going to come out after I contact them and make sure that it's all getting set up. And so if I don't have help at home, and if I'm trying to move someone who cannot ambulate himself, I have to have a whole different conversation with the hospital staff. And I just want to encourage people to keep this in mind. If you end up in the hospital with someone who is not doing well and who cannot move or make decisions for themselves, and you're talking about hospice, it's really important to be very clear with discharge planning. It's very important to be clear about, I don't have help there, help me get help, right? Yes. There are ways that medical people can help you get what you need so that you can get home and settled and get hospice engaged, right? There are people in the medical world that can help you access and get things set up for yourself. So thank you for that part of the story. I really appreciate that. Now, I also know that you did bring a hospice in.
Yes.
And that Larry died about 5 days later, I want to say?
He died exactly 8 days later.
8 days later, okay. So what what I'd like you to share just a little bit about, and that is that final day, that day where he was dying. Were you aware that he was dying? Were you taking time to be with him? So just...
Yes.
And what that was like for you.
And I was aware that he was dying because already he was put on hospice Saturday. It took a day to get hospice in. On Saturday and Sunday, he ate a little, drank some. Monday, he refused to eat. Monday, I was still trying to get him to drink water because I didn't want him to be dehydrated. And
So I just don't want to lose this point either. So this is very common, right? Sharon knows today that that we're not stopping someone from getting dehydrated. One of the things to know is that really basically pretty much all of us will one day or another die from not eating and not drinking. Now granted, all of that's brought on by an illness of some sort, but we don't need to give a body that is dying hydration, okay? In fact, if people who are actively dying get too much fluid in their body, it just lays in the body and it can cause congestion. It can even lay in the skin. If somebody's laying on their back like this, the water just lays underneath the skin because the body no longer needs it. So one of the things to understand is it's actually more supportive and kind to let the body die the way it needs to die, rather than insisting that we have to hydrate, we have to feed this body, right? Because it's actually not true at this point anymore. Understandably, because we don't talk about this in our culture, that we would all think that had to be part of what we should be doing. When really what we're talking about is when someone is actively dying, now is the time for family and loved ones to sit back, right? There's nothing more to do. What is really mine to do at this point is to be present with, okay? Be with what is going on. Not try and fix it, not try and take care of, right? I get to sit and to be present with. So yes. Can you talk just a little bit about being present with
yes.
Larry?
And that is when Tuesday hospice stepped back in. And when they had been there Saturday, they thought it could be a week or two, which is why I thought he still needed water. But they said, oh, he's already actively dying, which shocked me. And then they put him on either a higher dose of morphine or the morphine. I'm not sure if he was taking the morphine yet then. And they said, no more water. And they said, you could just be with him. And that's when I reached out to Julie, because it had happened sooner than I expected it to. They had said a couple of weeks. Then they were saying a couple of days, maybe 5 at the most. And so at that point, thank goodness, with hospice and with Julie, I realized that I did not have, there was no point in trying. In fact, it could create problems to try to make him eat and drink. And I was able to just kind of be with him and to hold his hand, to sit by the bed, to talk with him. By Wednesday, he was already slipping into unconsciousness. And then he remained unconscious all of Thursday and Friday. And Saturday when they came in, they said, probably today he'll pass, or tomorrow at the most, and he passed that day.
Right. So yeah, and I really appreciate that, Sharon, because it's like, this is another thing that happens often is hospice will say, well, it looks like this, right? And here's what I want to say about this. Sometimes people get mad at hospice because they say, well, hospice told me. But it's really important to remember here that none of us has a map for how any individual is going to die. Those of us who have worked in end-of-life care for a period of time, we begin to see patterns, right? You can kind of see it happening, But the truth is, a whole bunch of things affect when and how someone dies. So it's even things like, sometimes I've watched people wait for a son or a daughter or a sister to come across the country to say goodbye before that person can die, right? I've also seen the opposite happen, which is someone will wait until everybody leaves the room and then they die, right? On the outside, we tend to have a whole bunch of rules about how we think it should go, right? Oftentimes the person who is the closest to the person who is dying expects that they are going to be there when that loved one dies. And often that's not the case. Sometimes it's when that person leaves the room that someone dies. I want to explain again to you how I kind of see this right now. This is just my take on it. And that is that it takes attention and intention to move the life force out of the body, right? And our hearts and our energy are connected to people. So for some of us, if there's too many people in the room, or if the person that I'm the closest to is there, it's a lot harder to move out of the body, right? And so sometimes that's when we'll see people waiting for everybody to leave. Other times, other ones of us, depending upon how we've lived, will want people there with us. So we just never know exactly how that's going to go. And I believe, if I remember right, Larry died after you left the room. Isn't that right?
Really, it was within minutes.
Right. That's how I remember
minutes.
that. Right.
My daughter was showing up at 4. My stepson had shown up at 3:30, but didn't have the courage to come up yet to sit with his dad. And his good friend, who he'd known for 50 years, was coming at 5. Larry, I walked away to meet my daughter at the gate. I had to open up the gate. By the time I came back upstairs, he was gone.
He was gone. Right. So, yeah. So I just think this is a really important piece. It's like, oh, okay. So this is how it had to be for Larry to do it his way, right? I think this is another thing that we forget about in dying. It's like the culture has kind of rules. They're all made up, but we call them, this is how it should go. But the truth is, we are all going to die uniquely and in our own way. And just like we have lived uniquely and in our own way, we will die doing the same thing. And I think it's really important for us not to lose sight of that's actually how life goes, even though we have all these other ideas about how it should go, right? So Carol, thank you, Sharon, very much. I want to come to Carol. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Good. So if you would take just a few minutes to share with people a little bit about Peter's trajectory and how that went for you. Remembering too that he was in a facility. He was in skilled care at that time. Okay, Carol, you are muted. Can you unmute yourself? Do you have a little button there so you can unmute yourself? I don't think we can do it from this end. Give us just a second. Yeah. Whoop, we lost her. No. Your unmute should be right next to your camera there. Is there a little microphone with a line through it? You. Okay. So while we're waiting for Carol to do that, I want to talk a little bit about how we say goodbye, right? Generally in hospice for years, with families about how to say goodbye. And so we have 5 little points that can be helpful as a guideline for any of us to say goodbye to someone that we love. And we're going to put this up on the screen so that you can see it. You might want to take a screenshot of it if you can, just so that you have this in your back pocket. Okay, I wrote this out for myself so that I had something for people to look at. So the first thing that we talk about is being able to go to that person and say, I forgive you for anything you may have done to hurt me, whether you were aware of it or not. Okay? Now, often when I would say this to families, they would say, but I don't have to forgive them for anything that they did to me. And what I want us all to remember is that that may be true, but we never know what someone else might be carrying with them, feeling like they feel guilty about something or feel bad about something that they did or said to you, but you guys have never talked about it. Maybe it didn't bother you, but it might be bothering that person, okay? So this is a really important first step. The second thing that you can say to someone is to say, will you please forgive me for anything that I might have done to hurt you, whether I knew it or not, right? This is really important. It's like, will you please forgive me? You're now doing this for yourself, and you're doing it for the person who is dying. The third thing we always encourage people is, I love you, okay? I forgive you. Will you please forgive me? I love you. Now, one of the ways that I think that can be important with this is, first of all, you want to take enough time with this. We don't have to just tick these off one by one, right? But it's like, you can share stories at that point. It's like, one of the things I love the most about you is that you were always there for me when I needed whatever, or I loved the cakes you baked, or whatever it is, you get to share how it is that that person affected your life, okay? So it's I love you, and then it's thank you. Thank you for all of the ways that you are important in my life. And you can even say what those things are. And if you're doing this with someone who's consciously aware, you can actually begin to have conversation about it. And then the fifth thing that we encourage people to do is to say goodbye, right? Often what happens when we say goodbye, our tears come up, right? Here's something I want you to remember. It is okay to share your tears with someone who is dying, because none of us ever gets through the dying process without our hearts breaking. And often what that breaking heart looks like is tears. It's how we share our intimacy, our vulnerability. And here's something to remember. When I love deeply, I grieve deeply, right? And so when I say goodbye to someone that I love, in all likelihood, my tears are going to come up. And it's okay to share those, okay? I hope that this is helpful for you. And like I said, if you want, you can take a screenshot of it so that you have it just as something to consider. I understand that Carol is back and that we can hear her now, so I want to go back to Carol for a minute if we can. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I hope you can hear me.
And I can hear you, so we're good to go. So I'd really appreciate if you would share a little bit about the dying process, especially for you as you were with
Peter went to live in the facility at the end of 2017, and 4 months later, he was put on hospice. He met some certain elements of the criteria that qualified him. So he began hospice in spring of 2018 and was on hospice for over 3 years. So that's different from other people's journeys that their loved ones took. Sharon makes me think of a moment for several days where Peter was taken off hospice. He had a seizure. The facility took him to emergency. I was alerted and I went straight to the emergency room and I said, we're going to discharge him. Stop what you're doing. I'm taking him. So there was a moment that a family member could act on behalf of the person.
Right. So,
That
Carol,
was,
so yeah, before we move on from that, this is a really important piece to take a minute just to talk about. And that is when someone is on hospice, right? One of the criteria is that we don't do life-saving measures when someone is on hospice. It's all about comfort care. We're going to keep this person as comfortable as possible. So what Carol did was she intervened on Peter's behalf. She knew he was in hospice. They had made those decisions. She had made very clear decisions about his care. So when she heard that he was hospitalized or in the ER, that's why she went immediately to make sure that they understood that he was on hospice and that they were not doing any extraordinary measures. This is really important to remember because family members have the power to do this. And so it's up to us to be able to advocate for people when they are in this frame of mind and this state. So go ahead, Carol. Thank you for that.
so because of that seizure, he was immediately put back onto hospice. So he was off probably less than 24 hours. Just one of those things. So COVID hit. And there was a part of me that was very much missing the experiences that Sharon was having, making sure her husband was comfortable at home and safe, and being grateful that Peter was in a facility where that was being taken care of to the best of their ability. And I was grateful that I didn't have to be the watchdog for trying to help out. But it caused 1 year's worth of no visiting, no contact. Fortunately, hospice was involved and I had FaceTime. I had people who would go and have interactions with him, caregiving and FaceTiming me. That was wonderful. It also gave me an opportunity to consider, well, beyond COVID, when Peter passes, what will I be doing? So I went ahead and made a motion to establish a cottage setting in Georgia so I could be closer to the grandchildren. So then after the active dying piece came for Peter, I was allowed to see him. And the last 3 days, I stayed by his side. I came and went so I could go home and sleep, but then come back again. And I read passages, inspirational passages to him. Part of that thank you was for great memories. And I told him, remember the time we went up to a lake and we had a canoe and our son and I got in the canoe and we started paddling and you watched from the shore for a while and finally you said, I don't care which one of you gets up and turns around, but one of you has to do it. Because we're paddling the same against each other. Nothing was happening.
Right.
So I
You
told him,
shared
I know you're
memories with
laughing
him.
in there. But at this point, the morphine was taking its effect. Among all the other losses, now he didn't shut his eyes. So his eyes were open. I put lip balm on to keep his lips from cracking. Held his hand. Stayed present.
Yeah, right, right. And we can see that it's still very close to your heart. Peter still resides in your heart. It hasn't been very long, and I really appreciate your willingness to be present and talk about it and to stay in your heart at the same time. I know this is not always easy. These moments are very powerful, and being present with someone that we love matters, right? That's what I appreciate you speaking to, right, Carol, today. It's like you showed up and advocated for him when you needed to, and then as soon as you were allowed to be back in with him, you were there and present with him. very powerful. This is what it means to walk someone home, right? It's that we show up and we're present. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I know we are getting short on time here, so there's just a couple of things I want to talk about quickly before we close. One of the things that can be really helpful when someone is actively dying is to do things to bring the outdoors in, right? There's something very powerful about having a plant in the room, or maybe you cut fresh flowers from the garden, or maybe you go to the store and bring some. Sometimes people will go out into the yard and bring even some rocks, or I've seen children paint symbols on rocks and leave them at the bedside. There's all kinds of ways to actively participate in someone completing their own life, because really what we're talking about is, how do I bring my heart and my experience and my compassion into the room? Because this is how we say goodbye. We say goodbye with our words, with our hearts, and with our presence. And when someone is actively dying, the most important thing we can do is to be fully present with that person. So I want to show you one more little book. This is called 11th Hour. This is also written by Barbara Cairns. This is a very good discussion about how to be present when someone is actively dying, no longer talking with you, and when the only thing that's left to do is to sit and to be present with someone. So again, if you go on to bkbooks.com, this is another one that is listed there. I think she has 5 different ones, along with some videos. So there's lots of information there for you if you want to explore this further. So it's time for us to say goodbye for today. This is one of those conversations that we could probably have for about 6 hours, which we won't do today. But we have decided to extend this series by 1 more week. And so I am going to be back here with you next week at the same time. And we're going to talk about life after loss. So that we've really kind of covered over the last 3 weeks what it looks like to move through the life completion process. And the piece that we really don't want to miss is, how do we take care of ourselves when we're living with grief, and what does that feel like, look like, and how do I show up for myself and for others after we lose someone we love and find ourselves with our sadness, and sometimes with our anger, sometimes with our confusion and uncertainty. And so I am looking forward to seeing you next week. Like I said, we've extended it from 3 weeks to 4, so we can talk about life after loss. Thanks so much for being here today. I appreciate everyone being here. Thank you to Nancy and Sharon and to Carol for sharing their stories with us today. Thank you. Okay, give Dave.